Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Analyst's College Football Day-to-Day Show presented by Stats Perform. I'm your host, Mike Leon. We're back, man. We have been off for a few weeks, but we are back. A big week upcoming in college football as the calendar turns to November. Few top 25 matchups this weekend. The college football playoff bracket, the first released happened this past week. We're going to break it all down, featuring stats and insights from not only the good folks over at the Analyst, but from Stats Perform's amazing tool called PressBox Live. You can head to statsperform.com today to find out how PressBox Live is being utilized by college football teams, conferences, broadcasters, and more to help augment their game day coverage on Saturdays. Joining me, as always, to break down the college football landscape, the Amari Stoudemire to my Steve Nash, now two unemployed Brooklyn Net former people, data scientist over at Stats Perform, and a college football writer over at The Analyst, Mr. Evan Boyd. Evan, welcome back to the show. What's going on, my friend?
Well, as someone who is 5'8", I think that's the first time I've ever been compared to a 6'10" power forward. But I always appreciate a comment like that. So it's good to be back. We did miss last week, but honestly, it was sort of a down week, right? Because a lot of teams were on buys, some teams were playing non-conference games. So I'm glad we're back into it. We got a game of the century, so it's going to be a
Yep.
fun one.
Well, you fed right into the follow-up because first I want to get your takeaways on the bracket release here in week 10. Tennessee, Ohio State, Georgia, and Clemson are the top four teams according to the College Football Playoff Committee. Michigan, Alabama, TCU, and Oregon round out the top eight. Alabama and Oregon both have one loss right now. Michigan and TCU are undefeated. Your thoughts on the initial first bracket release here by the committee?
Yeah, two things. One, Clemson seems to be a little bit higher than I thought, despite their undefeated record. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but I really think that Clemson is performing better than what their or worse than what their record shows, because they had some close wins. They've had some really close games. We saw with that game against Syracuse that they basically had to crawl their way out in the fourth quarter to win that game. But, still credit to them for winning these games and coming back. But if we see, compared to those other teams like Ohio State, which is just blowing out teams, I want to see some more from Clemson. We'll see how it'll shake up as we prevail through the next couple of weeks. But one other thing I want to mention is that I feel like this is a rough spot for Michigan, because Michigan is playing great football right now, and to not be in that top, threshold, I think really hurts them, because they're going to have a very tough game at Ohio State. And unless, they win that game, Ohio State's going to be favored in that game. It's going to be really tough for them to try and make it back to the playoffs. It looks like he doesn't even want to see them in the playoff if they are a one-loss team, which I think is kind of unfair because they've been playing great football.
Yeah, they have been playing really well. It's true. And Alabama jumping, TCU there. There's some discussion around that. Obviously, Michigan heading to my alma mater. Did you see the Rutgers helmet for those of you watching on YouTube to take on the Scarlet Knights this weekend? Let's dive into, you said game of the century. This always happens in college football. And it's kind of why, not that I'm opposed to a bigger playoff that will be expanding in a few years, but you get matchups like this throughout the season where they're playoff like games. And you have it in this first matchup coming up this Saturday, the first game we're going to preview here as the Volunteers head to Athens, Georgia to take on the Georgia Bulldogs. I mean, a matchup of undefeated teams, both teams 8-0. The winner's going to be in the driver's seat for the SEC East, and whoever they'll face out of the West. We'll probably get into that in a sec with Alabama and LSU. But your thoughts on this incredibly big game, as Tennessee, for the first time in the college football playoff history, is the number one team in the land, according to the CFP committee, and they head to Georgia to take on the defending champs.
Yeah, I love this matchup. I think it's a perfect matchup just in terms of an excitement level, because they are two different teams and both teams are very fun to watch. So I'm really looking forward to this. I do think it's going to be the game of the year. If you recall, game of the century, the last such game was LSU at Alabama back in 2019. That was a tremendous game, which LSU prevailed en route to a Joe Burrow Heisman and a national championship. So I think we're seeing a lot of comparisons, similar to that game, right? That Alabama team was the runner-up the previous season. Georgia was just the reigning champions, and Tennessee is now this hot, streaky team with a tremendous offense that could really be compared to LSU. I'd like to have some numbers here. Tennessee right now is averaging 49.4 points per game and 21 points per game allowed. LSU through 8 games of that 2019 season was almost the exact same, 47 points per game and 20 points per game allowed. We have a similar Heisman comparison with Hendon Hooker and Joe Burrow. I think it's really easy to make the comparison. Joe Burrow obviously had a historic season, and Hooker's not going to get to his 60 touchdown feat, but Hooker has been leading FBS in yards per attempt, and maybe he, still doesn't have the flash as Joe Burrow. He's able to have deep balls to help them win games and honestly be en route to possibly a playoff appearance. It's been a tremendous offense to watch, and we saw that with that tremendous game against Alabama. So LSU that year had two incredible receivers. Everyone now knows them as the NFL stars. You have Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson. Crazy to think that team had two of those wide receivers, but the Vols might not have that dynamic duo, but they do have Jalen Hyatt, and Jalen Hyatt has been an incredible leap in his junior season. He might be the best wideout in the SEC. He leads the FBS in receiving touchdowns and is fourth in receiving yards. And I actually have a few advanced stats for him. He has 8 touchdown catches this year of passes that traveled at least 20 yards downfield. That's 3 more than any other player in the Power 5. So obviously he and Hooker are really connecting with this deep ball that Georgia is really going to have to watch out for. Georgia isn't the number one, but I still feel like we're taking them for granted a little bit, if you know what I mean. They're a tremendously talented team, and while they might not have an historic defense like last season, they still have 2 shutouts and are second in the FBS in points allowed. They're very, very, very good defensively. So we have an unstoppable force offensively against this immovable obstacle with the Georgia defense. So I think it's exactly like LSU and Alabama back in 2019, isn't it? I found that this team is going to have reached historic success on the other side of the ball. I also found this interesting too. Georgia is 4th in the FBS in time of possession, averaging about 35 minutes. Tennessee averages 26 in roughly a half minute. And that's 6th lowest in the FBS. So Tennessee loves those deep balls, getting scores quickly. Georgia loves controlling the ball. So I think it's really going to see who is able to, play their own game as much as possible. So Tracer is Georgia's slightly favorite due to the home bias at about 62%. Tracer is Stats Reform's team rating adjusted for the conference and the roster on the field. I think I'll go with Georgia on this one. It's going to be a fun one.
It's funny. As you were saying that, and I was going to ask you for your prediction. You gave it already with Georgia winning, but one thing to watch for in this matchup, in my opinion, is Tennessee's defense. Travion Flowers, Hayden, both have 2 interceptions. The Vols have 9 interceptions on the year. That's ranked 22nd in the FBS right now. They held Kentucky last week to 6 points in a 44-6 trouncing. They went to LSU and they won 40-13, 19 combined points in those 2 SEC games. Tennessee, obviously the anomaly with Alabama in that game with 49, but Tennessee's defense has played pretty decent over the last few weeks, given the competition. One stat I wanted to mention, courtesy of Press Box Live, when Georgia allows 30 points in the Kirby Smart era, they are 1-9. And when they allow less than that, they are 73-6. That is a very telling stat. I am going to pick, I think Hooker's on a magical ride right here. I think somehow he drives Tennessee down, late field goal. Second game of the century, part due. I will take the Volunteers. You take Georgia. As Mike Francesa would say, a checker on a checker there. Let's move into our second game because this feeds in perfectly. SEC East. Now we go SEC West. Alabama, LSU. I just mentioned where Alabama is in the college football playoff. LSU 6-2 under first year coach Brian Kelly there. For a couple of games I just mentioned, their loss to Tennessee. But the Tigers have played pretty decent as of late. I'm interested to get your thoughts on now Alabama has some motivation. They already have 1 loss. They know they can't afford another one, given where they are in the rankings. You see TCU right behind them undefeated, Michigan in front of them undefeated, and 1 loss Oregon, who could potentially still run the Pac-12, sitting right there at 8 and could jump them if they were to lose another game. Your thoughts on Alabama and LSU?
First off, man, does Alabama have a tough schedule or what? They go on the road to Texas, have to escape that one. Went to Tennessee on the road. They almost even won that one. That was a tremendous game. Even to Arkansas, we thought Arkansas was going to be really good at the time of the game. And now to LSU, That's a really tough schedule. And props to Nick Saban and this team for really stepping up and being able to escape or at least come close to it. Being a one-loss team in this schedule, I think, is very impressive. I really do. So Alabama's defense really came back after showing 52 points to Tennessee. They allowed 6 to Mississippi State. The Bulldogs entered that game averaging over 35 points per game. So we see that they really did a good job stopping with it. I am a little curious about the Alabama offensive line right now. The running game was not great against Mississippi State, and they were able to get to Bryce Young a little bit. So I'm curious to see if there's something going on there. Maybe LSU can take advantage of it. But let's see if Alabama can do that on the other side to Jaden Daniels, because Jaden Daniels has rushed for 121 yards and 3 touchdowns 2 weeks ago against Ole Miss. He has 6 rushing touchdowns in his last 2 games. That's unreal for a quarterback. So both teams are coming off of a bye and have plenty of time to study one another. So I think both quarterbacks are actually going to struggle in this game, especially after seeing the recent effects. I don't think Daniels is going to have 3 rushing touchdowns as he has in the past 2 games, but maybe Alabama won't be able to have him. They're going to really have to have a spy on him. Tracer thinks that Alabama has about a 70% chance of this game. I'm going to stick with that. I'm going to stick with the Crimson Tide here. I trust the rest of the Tide to get the job done, even if Young might have some trouble against this LSU defense.
I'm with you on that too. I like Alabama in this game, even though LSU in their last 3, they've won 3 out of their last 4 SEC games. They beat Ole Miss last week, 45-20. They went on the road a few weeks back in mid-October and beat the Gators. Obviously, I mentioned the loss to Tennessee that they had at home, and then they had a close win prior to that against Auburn. I've liked the way they have kind of rebounded after that first game loss against FSU, and we know how that game ended and how crazy it was. They've won 6 of their last 7 since then. LSU is 4-1 at home. But there's something about Alabama understanding back against the wall right now. They cannot afford another loss. It does not matter. One more loss, and they're pretty much eliminated if they want to get into that conversation or discussion and represent specifically the SEC West, because they did lose to an SEC East opponent. So they know getting to Atlanta and playing in the SEC championship game is a must. I like Nick Saban. I trust Nick Saban a little bit more than Brian Kelly in this
I do too.
situation. Yeah, so
Yeah.
I'll take Alabama as well, as will probably the country, to be honest. Let's shift over to the ACC. We've covered a lot of ACC football on this, but the ACC has had a pretty good year so far. Clemson has done well. Wake Forest and NC State and Syracuse have been in the top 25. You talked about that Syracuse Clemson game and what a fun game that was to watch. Here we have Clemson playing a pseudo ACC opponent in Notre Dame. Notre Dame has kind of rebounded back since the first 2 weeks where they lost that game. At Ohio State, couldn't put up a lot of points, even though they were up at half. They ended up losing 21-10. Probably the closest game Ohio State has played this year. And then they lose to Marshall, coming back home. But since then, 5-3, they went up to the Dome and beat the Cuse last week, a ranked Syracuse team, 41-24. Before that, they've obviously beat UNLV. They beat BYU at home. So Notre Dame has kind of bounced back, even though they're 5-3 right now. This is a night game up there, in Indiana. Clemson, you mentioned 8-0. They're number 3 right now in the college football playoff ranking, but a tricky 8-0, right? Struggling to barely hang on to beat Clemson. Same thing with Florida State. They went down to the Doak and won a 6-point game there. What are your thoughts right now on this ACC matchup? As Clemson knows, they're pretty much in the driver's seat. They win out and they get to the ACC championship, and they'll be able to play in the college football playoff if all things hold up right now. Clemson, Notre Dame, give me some of your takeaways.
Yeah, Tracer has been harsh on Clemson this year, as I mentioned before. They're 8-0, but they've won 3 games by a touchdown, including their last 2. And they had a great fourth quarter just to beat Syracuse. They almost lost that game. And while we like teams like Wake Forest, Florida State, and just some of those other teams that Clemson has played, Syracuse, all of those teams within the top 30 in the country in terms of Tracer, Clemson had to go on the road twice for those games and one at home. And so seeing them win all 3 of those games is a bit surprising because the ACC is on the rise this year. But it does help that they are balanced on both sides of the ball. But if one side falls in a game, can the other one make up for it? I'm not exactly sure about that. Notre Dame, meanwhile, just had their best game of the season. They beat Syracuse on the road by more than 2 touchdowns. Does that mean the Irish on the rise? I don't know because they did. Remember, we saw this earlier in the season. They beat North Carolina. They beat BYU. It seemed like they got everything together, and then they lose at home to Stanford. And it's like, well, okay, Irish, what are you doing right here? But the defense really stepped up against Syracuse. They made a huge statement early on in that game. It was the first play of the game being a pick six, and they never really looked back from there. So I think they might have to do something exactly like that in order to beat Clemson. One other thing. Special teams has been really good for Notre Dame this year. Four different players have blocked a punt this season. Their punt return game has been strong. That's something Clemson is going to have to look out for. And if they can take advantage of maybe one miscue from Clemson on that side, they can have a real chance of this game. Tracer thinks that Clemson is going to win this game about 57.7% of the time, so 58% of the time. I'm going to go the upset here, though. I think Notre Dame is playing their best football now, and I think they're going to win it on the defensive game and on the special teams game while having solid offense here and there to take over and beat Clemson and knock them out of the top four in the playoff.
Wow. Very, very huge.
It's bull.
Yeah, seriously. I mean, you know
Yeah.
what? Listen, the one thing I will say is Clemson is 3-0 so far this year on the road. I mentioned that they won up at Florida State. We know the crazy 2 overtime game that they played to win at Wake Forest. And then they won in a road game, in Atlanta against Georgia Tech to open up the season. Georgia Tech, obviously, towards the bottom of the ACC. So they haven't really been tested so much on the road. That Florida State game, Florida State, made it kind of close late. The Wake Forest game is the one that probably
Wake Forest was close.
yeah,
Yeah.
that was probably the game of the year so far in the ACC. So this is a really true road test. I'm agree with you that Notre Dame, I think right now, Marcus Freeman has got the troops, playing football the way he wants to. I'm sure he would love to have that Marshall game back. So they would be in a little bit better position to maybe close out the year and get a New Year's Six bowl. But right now, I don't know. I think Clemson, this is eerily similar to a few years ago where they were right in that 2 to 3 range, and they knew the ACC, and in terms of what they have left on the schedule, they should be able to win out. And Dabble was able to pull out some of these close games on the road. I like Clemson, and not so fast.
Okay.
My friend, Mister
All
Mister,
right, all
not
right.
so fast.
What one more thing? You
Yeah,
you mentioned a good point about Clemson, having some road games. I think they've been tested more than you might think, but Notre Dame's actually kind of the opposite. They have been playing much better on the road than at home this season, and
right.
maybe that will be a factor into Clemson winning this game. They can possibly win one up north there.
Yeah, that's true. They're 2-0 against two of the ACC's best, with beating North Carolina and Syracuse both on the road. Notre Dame did. Let's shift to another ACC game that's actually another top 25 matchup, a little bit light on the conference top 25 matchups all around. But this one caught my eye because we just mentioned Wake Forest. We just mentioned NC State, two teams that are both 6-2 right now, ranked in the top 25. A fun matchup. The offenses have been lighting it up, but NC State lost their leader in Devin Leary and still was able to come back last week and pull out that game. Again, we've been mentioning the ACC, a lot of good football in the ACC this past year. What are some of your thoughts on Wake Forest and NC State on Saturday?
I disagree. I think this is going to be kind of a sloppy game based on how these teams have been performing recently. Wake Forest completely blew up in the third quarter against Louisville last week. And while I do think Louisville is playing better football, there's no excuse for the Demon Deacons in that third quarter. They were outscored 35-0, allowing big plays. They threw 2 pick sixes. They got fumbling the ball. They had 8 turnovers in that game. That's really bad. And I was shocked by a Wake Forest team whose offense has really carried them throughout the season. Wheels just fell off for them, especially for Sam Hartman. It was surprising given how good he's been this season. He actually had an incredible touchdown pass to end the second quarter, or late in the second quarter. They almost were able to score again in the second quarter. They just ran out of time. And NC State has not been impressive on offense whatsoever. The Wolfpack have gone 2-2 in their last 4 games. Those 2 wins were decided by a combined 3 points, so they easily could have gone 0-4 in those. And so we'll see if they can really take on a Wake Forest team whose defense has not been their strong suit. It's definitely the offense there. So Wake Forest's offense in the season is still real good, despite last week's game against Louisville. Maybe the Louisville game was a fluke just because of all the turnovers, but I don't think so. I think they had to see a lot within themselves to try to recover from that game. Defense is still subpar for Wake Forest. Tracer has their defense right in the middle of the FBS. So I shouldn't say subpar. It's literally about par. But NC State is a better team defensively, but I really just don't like their offense this year. I think this is going to be kind of a toss-up game in terms of which team will end up prevailing. If this game was a few weeks ago, I would have easily said Wake Forest. I'm still going to go Wake Forest, but Tracer has this game at about 65%. I think it would have been much higher a few weeks ago. I'll still go with the Demon Deacons. I think they can learn from their mistakes from last week compared to the NC State Wolfpack, who have had 4 games lately to try and test themselves, and they've either escaped or lost. So I'm not really seeing much for the Wolfpack in this one.
Yeah, Coach Dave Doran, he's been trying a bunch of different things on the offensive side of the football since Leary went out with an injury a few weeks back. You mentioned last week about that Wake Forest game. I mean, 6 turnovers came in that third quarter, 35 points scored by the Cardinals in that quarter off of those 6 turnovers. That's a lot. I mean, you'd never see something like that. Such an anomaly for a team that's very veteran laden. Quarterback Sam Harton, if they had won that game, they're 7-1 and playing good football again, heading into the final few weeks here of the season. And I'm with you, though. I like the way Wake Forest has bounced back in games after losses over the past couple of years and under Coach Clausen. So I think that they will be ready to take on the Wolfpack. I just don't like the way the Wolfpack have been able to move the football. They should have lost that Virginia Tech game last week. They were trailing to a 2-5, 2-6 team. And somehow they came back in that game, but it looked like an almost insurmountable 12-point game. It was a 12-point game, 2 scores. And just NC State just couldn't do anything right on the offensive side of the football. And somehow they figured it out late. Give me Wake Forest winning out there in Raleigh. All right. Before we wrap up here, Evan, a matchup to watch, something you got your eye on for this Saturday in college football. We talked about the college football playoff and the rankings, the big matchups in the SEC and ACC. What's a game that you're watching for this Saturday?
I'm surprised we didn't even talk about Texas and Kansas State. Maybe it's just because of the records, but especially after last week, Kansas State is one of those teams to really watch out for. Texas is one of those teams whose record really doesn't show their true talent. They're 5-3, but they rank 7th in Tracer, actually. And that why? Because they've beaten the teams they should beat. They've crushed teams that might have come as a surprise, and they've only lost close games. Their 3 losses have been up by a combined 11 points. I mean, one of those games was to Alabama, which they nearly won. Another one that was to Texas Tech, which they lost by a field goal in overtime. So that one really could have been anyone's game. That's why we've been seeing the Longhorns as favorites in a lot of games. That's why Vegas has them as favorites in this game, actually. But here comes Kansas State. Kansas State made a huge jump after last week, trouncing not Ohio State, Oklahoma State. I'd like to see Kansas State, Ohio State, see how that goes. But they trounced Oklahoma State after the Cowboys beat the Longhorns, and they shot up in Tracer. They're now 6th in Tracer, right ahead of Texas. And recall, they haven't been really good on the season level, though. They lost to Tulane at home this year. Some of their wins have been too close, but they are playing their best football right now. There's a huge gap between those two teams in the top 5 in Tracer, I might add. So I'm not really talking about these teams being playoff contenders, obviously with their record. But these two teams are going to have a fun shootout, I would say. These two teams were playing at a neutral site. It would basically be dead even and neck, but the home advantage, I think, helps K-State here, and I think it's a night game as well, so I think that's going to help. It's about 60-40 in favor of Kansas State per Tracer. We'll go with the Wildcats. I'll say Kansas State, but I think this is going to be a real close one. And both teams have been playing close games throughout the season, so I think Texas is going to suffer another close loss. They've been really struggling with these close games, so I think, unfortunately, that's going to bite them yet again.
Yeah, Kansas State has been playing pretty good football. Adrian Martinez, the Nebraska transfer, has just had, college football game day over on ESPN did a piece on him recently and just what he's been able to do this off season, getting prepared as he transferred to Kansas State. He has had a really good season. For me, I've been mentioning the Pac-12. I love me some Pac-12 after dark. 10:30 p.m. here on the East Coast. You get to watch some college football. Yeah, you'll be asleep. I'll be awake because sitting number 9, right behind Oregon, one-loss Oregon in the college football playoff rankings is USC. And I've been high on USC, not because so much of them, it's because they've only had one blip. And we've mentioned it before, and it was that 1-point loss to Utah on the road. They next two games, they play Cal at home this Saturday, who's 3-5. They play Colorado, who's the worst team in the Pac-12. All of that before they take on UCLA, their crosstown rivals, and then close out with Notre Dame. I really like what USC is going to be able to do here. They need to win this game. Caleb Williams has still been playing really well. USC needs this. They cannot afford to lose it. And there's a lot of traffic in front of them. Somebody could lose potentially on the road. We mentioned Alabama's got that game at LSU. TCU, what they have closing out the schedule. Watch out for USC. We leave it there. My thank yous to Evan Boyd. As always, you can check out Evan's work over at The Analyst. He's a data scientist over at Stats Perform. We're going to check out how he's done record-wise, too. We're going to come back in our next episode and see how everybody has done so far. Yeah, we're going to bring the stats and receipts on the record. So I thank you to Evan Boyd. Thank you to everybody watching this on our YouTube channel at The Analyst. Hit the subscribe button for me, audio podcast platforms. Leave us a 5-star review and comment, please. We'll see everybody next time. Enjoy the college football Saturday. For Evan Boyd, I am Mike Leon. We'll see you next time.